chairmanship and to follow the speeches of so many honourable and gallant friends who have spoken so compellingly about their own service and how that translates into the way they see things now as policymakers. My congratulations also to my honourable friend, Member for Southport, who I thought opened the debate with great clarity, and his speech being very well received by all ex-service people watching. It pains me, however, Mr Bone, that the Minister to respond to this is my immediate neighbour, the Honourable Member for Westminster Hall. He and I are great friends, and I'm afraid that I must not pull any of my punches, but I do rather feel it should be the Ministry of Defence in here responding rather than the Northern Ireland office. Now, Mr Bone, I am delighted to.
I'm most grateful that I did miss the beginning of the debate. Could I just say to him that I hope he'll join me in saying to the Minister that he needs to address the Stormont House Agreement when he responds to this debate, because I rather fear that the reason we're in this predicament on Northern Ireland veterans is because of the terms of that agreement, and in particular in relation to historical investigations.
I agree very much indeed with my honourable friend. He is right that there is a political angle to this that is most unfortunate, and I will come to that later in my remarks. First of all, though, Mr Bone, I am just deeply concerned by any suggestion that there is an equivalence between the actions that I and so many other former service personnel have taken on operations and those actions taken by terrorists who were out to illegally take life. There is no equivalence. And in the urgent question on Thursday morning, there was a disappointing line deployed by the government which seemed to suggest that these letters of comfort would not endure, and that if they didn't endure, that all would therefore be open to prosecution. Well, I simply say that whilst that corrects an imbalance, I'll come to the Honourable Gentleman in just a second, whilst that corrects an imbalance, it by definition creates an equivalence in which we're basically saying, well, at least both sides can be investigated and prosecuted. And that's simply not acceptable. There is no equivalence at all. I give way.
Very quickly, Maureen David Griffith is aged 78. He's a Chelsea pensioner. He killed an IRA gunman in 1972 who was about to assassinate one of his comrades. He was investigated at the time and exonerated. 47 years later, he's being investigated again by the PSNI. They will not tell him his fate. He was an Irish Catholic born in Dublin. Sorry.
The Honourable Member understands if this is sub judice, we shouldn't be pursuing it.
No, it's not sub judice because it's not. No, sorry, Mr. Bone, I completely understand. It's not before a court. I completely understand the intervention. It's not before a court, and the case is in the public domain. Very quickly, he has no letter of comfort. He has no comfort of any kind. He's in utter limbo. He's a Chelsea pensioner, and he's very worried about it. Why does our government allow this to happen?
My honourable friend is absolutely right. There is no equivalence whatsoever. Whether the other side can now be investigated again or not, it is simply unreasonable, wrong, immoral, a breakdown of our covenant with our armed forces that we are allowing the investigation of those who have served to continue. Now, my honourable and gallant friend, the member for Beckenham, gave a quite amazing speech, actually, and in which he reflected that there was a time when his blokes thought that he had thrown them under the bus because they were required to go to court. And it was clear from his speech the pain that he felt in having to look his soldiers in the eye and break that news to them. I suspect that if those soldiers were watching you, Colonel, this afternoon, they would have been very proud to have seen someone that takes the responsibilities of command so seriously years after their watch is done. And I personally found that very powerful. And I think that all of us who have had the great privilege to carry a commission in Her Majesty's Armed Forces and to have command of soldiers, sailors and airmen will relate very strongly to the pain that he so clearly felt, that even now, in another career many years later, we feel like we are letting our riflemen, our guardsmen, our private soldiers down, and that is what motivates us all to be here. The first time that I was involved in any such process was in Kabul in 2005. It was about a year or so after I'd commissioned, and we had been involved in the use of lethal force following a double vehicle-borne suicide bombing. And throughout the afternoon and the evening that followed and overnight as we sort of stood on the perimeter, you go back through everything that you've done and you think tactically whether or not you did the right thing. When you get in the next morning having been relieved and the first thing you get is a date with the Royal Military Police Special Investigations Branch, I was pretty close to throwing punches. What I understand is that that is a very necessary part of applying lethal force on the battlefield. We are trained to live by a higher standard. We are trained to operate by a higher standard. And we should have nothing to fear when the investigation starts immediately on the back of the application of force like that. Years later, or 2 years later in Basra, and then 2 years later in Sangin, this process had become commonplace. Indeed, in Sangin, as a battalion adjutant in the most contested Herrick tour, in the most contested battle space, I was responsible for an awful lot of these initial investigation processes. And I can tell colleagues that the immediate debrief could not be accurate. Adrenaline was still coursing through the veins of the riflemen that had been involved. They were emotional because very often their friends had lost their legs or been killed in the very same mission. There was confusion about what happened because the fog of war was all around them, and as they relayed their own individual testimonies about what happened that afternoon, that night, that morning, very often it didn't match up with the testimony of the rifleman that stood immediately next to them fighting the same contact. Now, when you consider that in the process of us going through that investigation, it's a company second in command, drafting a report, coming up to the adjutant, us having a look at it, in going off to brigade, and the legal advisor looking at it, the Special Investigations Branch having a look at it, that rifleman was deployed on 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 more patrols in the next 7 days, in which there would be more kinetic activity, in which they would have applied lethal force, and on the back of which there were more reports by the company second in command coming up to the adjutant, so on and so forth. Very quickly, all of the detail of those missions starts to mesh into one. So much so that we had riflemen go to the coroner's hearings 6, 9 months, a year after the tour and not recognising the contemporary report of what happened that night when they applied lethal force. And the reason that I make that point, Mr. Bone, is that if days after they can't remember exactly what happened, if a year after they can't exactly what happened, is a natural part of the way that we deal with our mental health, that we seek to delete, we seek to overwrite. How on earth can we turn around to people decades later and replay back to them very accurate reports made at the time as part of the evidence against, and ask them to account for themselves in trying to establish their innocence once again? Those of us who have had that moment when a threat is perceived, and you, in the split second, you have to make a decision whether to apply lethal force because your life or the life of another is in danger. I will.
Excellent point. I just wonder whether the IRA terrorist would have all these access to all these, or we, the judge, would have access to all these reports you referred to.
My honourable and gallant friend is absolutely right. The IRA did not keep such records, and that is one of the great unfairnesses that I'll come on to. Those of us who have had that moment, when you've had to apply lethal force, we take it in a split second, and we do so hoping that all of our training, all of our instincts, everything that we've learnt since first going into the Army, Navy, Air Force, will mean that we take the right decision. But we know there's a danger that we might get it wrong. And we need to know that providing that we are within the rules of engagement, providing we can say squarely that we perceive the threat to be there, that our government will stand behind us for the actions that we have taken. Now, the MOD announcement this week, the written ministerial statement that may come tomorrow, is great news for those of us who served on Operation Herrick and Operation Telic. Already, my tour to Afghanistan in 2005 is more than 10 years ago. My tour to Basra in 2007 is already 10 years ago. And at the end of October this year, my final operational tour to Iraq and Afghanistan will also be more than 10 years ago. That should be huge comfort, and it will be, to tens of thousands of veterans who served in those theatres. But as somebody who served in Northern Ireland, and more importantly, as a constituency MP with many constituents who served in Northern Ireland, and as a former rifleman with many ex-rifleman friends who served in Northern Ireland, actually, I'm all right, Jack. And we have to remember that it is not okay to have one statute of limitation that applies to the conflicts that are most obviously in people's conscience, whilst to ignore that those who fought in Northern Ireland in just as trying circumstances, we've heard so many times this afternoon, that they are still left behind. In fact, it makes it worse. The legal premise on which my former comrades served in Northern Ireland is not their fault. The failings of any investigation that happened at the time is not their fault. Conversely, the quality of the investigations that happened at the time that allows vexatious politicians and lawyers to pore over the detail and challenge it decades later, that's not their fault either. The political situation in Northern Ireland now is not their fault. The fact that they pulled the trigger in Northern Ireland rather than in the Falklands or the Balkans or in Iraq or Afghanistan is not their fault. And the fact that the government hasn't done anything about this yet is also not their fault. Mr. Bone, this can't drag on any favour. A universal statute of limitation across all theatres is required, and it's required now. This isn't an amnesty. Our armed forces are not above the law. We ask of them higher standards than in civilian life. And when they fall short, we punish them in a way that would be draconian in any civilian employment setting. But if we understand some of what they do, and many of us in this room do, then we understand why they deserve this protection. We ask of them that they accept an unlimited liability in defence of our nation. We must accept the political liability that comes with saying, come what may, we've got your back. Yeah.